Before you scroll past, listen closely. This isn't just a story about a dog, but about a forgotten soul, a fearless little girl, and the snowstorm that brought them together. If you believe in quiet miracles and the healing power of love, stay with us. Tap like, hit subscribe, and let your heart follow them home. Montana, early December 1987. The sky above the forested ridges had turned a heavy iron gray, pressing low over the town of Gallatin Gateway. The town itself lay tucked between frost-laced evergreens and silent hills that looked like sleeping giants beneath thick white quilts. But a few miles beyond the last dirt road, deeper into the pine woods and perched on the edge of a narrow valley, stood a small wooden cabin half buried in snow, its chimney coughing out a thin trail of smoke that was quickly snatched by the wind. The snow had started falling the night before, gentle at first, but by midday it was thick and sideways, driven by a wind that roared like it remembered every secret the forest ever kept. Inside the cabin, Emily Hayes, a pale and freckled 9-year-old girl with wide hazel eyes and thick brown curls tucked under a knitted green cap, sat pressed against the frosted windowpane. Her cheeks were pink from the indoor heat, but her eyes carried a heaviness beyond her years. Emily was small for her age, with a slender frame and a quiet, inward sort of bravery, the kind that never shouted but showed itself in moments others overlooked. She lived here with her grandmother after losing her parents in a highway accident 2 winters ago. That tragedy had settled into her bones like the cold, not always visible, but always present. Her grandmother, Ruth Hayes, was a tall woman in her mid-60s, with a proud spine and hands calloused from decades of both war and wilderness. She had been a nurse during the Vietnam War, and though she rarely spoke of it, the past clung to her in moments of silence. Ruth had short silver hair, cropped close for practicality, and steel-gray eyes that rarely softened. She was not unkind, just hardened, like the frost outside, but her love for Emily was the one ember she still nursed close. The cabin had become their world, and the winter their annual trial. The wind howled like a beast in mourning. Ruth sat by the hearth, mending a frayed woolen glove, while Emily leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. She loved watching the snow, imagining each flake as a tiny letter from a sky that missed her. But then, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to wind or falling snow. It came faint and thin, like a whimper or a cry. Emily turned her head, eyes narrowing. There it was again, a low, broken sound, distant but persistent. She pressed her ear to the window, heart starting to thud with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. "Gran," she said softly. "Did you hear that?" Ruth didn't look up. "It's just the wind, Em." "No. It's different." Emily stood up and pulled on her coat, a padded red jacket 2 sizes too big, its sleeves rolled at the wrists. She wrapped a thick scarf around her neck and jammed her hands into mismatched mittens. Ruth's voice was firm. "You are not going out in that storm. But it sounds hurt. Like something's crying. Emily. It's getting dark. And there are cougars and worse things than wind out there." Emily hesitated at the door. The cabin creaked around them, like it too was listening. The wind had lessened for a moment, the world holding its breath. "I'll stay close," Emily said. "I swear." Ruth looked up at her. There was something about the way the girl's face, so like her late daughter's, was set in quiet determination. Ruth sighed and slowly stood. "At least take the sled," she said, pulling an old wooden toboggan from the corner. "And if you're not back in 20 minutes. "I will be," Emily whispered, already pushing open the door into the swirling white. The world outside was a chaos of snowflakes and shadows. The trees groaned under their frozen burden, and the air bit any skin not covered. Emily trudged forward, dragging the sled behind her. She followed the sound, which grew a little clearer, a little closer. It was a whine now. A pained, breathless whimper, coming from the tree line near the edge of the clearing. She squinted. Something dark against the whiteness. At first she thought it was a fallen log, or a pile of branches. But then it moved, just barely. It was a dog. A big one. As she got closer, she could make out the coloring, black and tan, with patches of white snow clinging to its fur. The dog was lying on its side, one back leg twisted at a strange angle, its chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Its eyes were closed, but its ears flicked at the sound of her boots. It was a German shepherd, she realized. Maybe a year or two old. He was young, but already large, probably 80 pounds. His fur was matted with ice, and his paw pads were cracked and bleeding. He let out a low whine, almost apologetic, as if ashamed of being found in such a state. Emily dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey," she whispered. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The dog opened his eyes, deep amber, fogged slightly with pain and cold. He didn't growl. He just stared at her, as if trying to decide if she was real. She reached out slowly, letting him sniff her mitten. Then, without another word, she took off her scarf and looped it gently under his chest. She slid the sled beside him and, grunting with effort, managed to pull his upper body onto it. The dog whimpered once, but didn't resist. It was as if he had already given up, and she was the last bit of warmth he'd ever know. The snow was deeper now. Each step burned her thighs, and the sled tugged hard behind her, the dog's weight nearly too much. But Emily dug her heels into the snow and pulled, breath coming in hot clouds. She kept her eyes on the orange light in the cabin window, her lighthouse. By the time she reached the door, her face was raw, her arms trembling, but the dog was still breathing. Barely. Ruth opened the door in a fury, then froze. Her gaze moved from Emily's snow-covered figure to the limp animal on the sled. "Dear God," she muttered, moving forward. "Emily. He's hurt. Real bad." Ruth said nothing for a moment. Then she reached down and helped lift the dog inside. Together they pulled him onto the rug in front of the fireplace. The warmth hit like a tide. The dog let out a soft groan and collapsed into unconsciousness. Emily collapsed too, beside him, her hand on his paw. Ruth looked at the girl, then the dog. Then, with a resigned sigh, she stoked the fire higher. The snowstorm held on, but inside the cabin, something had changed. Something had entered their world, half frozen, half wild, but not alone anymore. The wind had softened overnight, no longer the wrathful banshee clawing at the shutters, but a whispering presence that rustled the bare pines and sighed beneath the eaves. The morning light filtered through thick white clouds, casting a pale glow over the cabin walls. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke, damp wool, and something new, wet fur. Emily Hayes stirred first, curled beneath a thick woolen quilt near the hearth, her fingers still loosely resting on the injured dog's side. The German shepherd lay stretched out on the rug, his breathing slow but steady. The firelight danced across his coarse black and tan fur, revealing more clearly the mud-caked paws, the frost-burned ear tips, and the deep purple bruise forming along his haunches. The twisted back leg was swollen, bent unnaturally. Despite the pain, the dog remained eerily quiet. Not a whimper, not a growl, only the slow, stoic rhythm of survival. Emily sat up, rubbing her eyes. Her curls stuck out in odd directions, her flannel pajama shirt wrinkled and dusted with ash. She leaned closer to the dog, whispered, "You made it, buddy. You really did." He opened one eye, just slightly, and blinked at her. No bark. No tail wag. Just acknowledgement. She smiled. "I should give you a name." From the small kitchen alcove, the clink of metal stirred the silence. Ruth Hayes stood hunched over the stove, her broad shoulders cloaked in a wool shawl, pouring water into a battered kettle. Her expression was unreadable as she glanced back at the pair by the fire. She had been up before dawn, checking the woodpile, securing the shutters again, and whispering a prayer she didn't realize she still knew. "I thought I told you he'd need to sleep outside," Ruth said, her voice hoarse with sleep and age. Emily didn't look up. He wouldn't have survived. Ruth set the kettle down with a thunk. He still might not. He's alive. That's more than he had before. The older woman sighed. She rubbed her hands together and sat heavily at the worn pine table. There were dark circles under her eyes, and the weight of her worry showed in the tight lines around her mouth. She had been through enough winters to know how quickly hope could turn into heartache. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the girl and her grandmother, the fire crackling between them, and the dog who refused to cry out. After breakfast, 2 slices of toast and weak tea, Emily knelt beside the dog again, inspecting the leg. It was worse than she'd thought. The skin was warm, the swelling angry and red. She reached for the threadbare quilt folded nearby and draped it gently over his body. He didn't flinch, only let out a long, shallow breath and closed his eyes again. "I think his name is Shadow," she said aloud. Ruth looked up. "Shadow?" Emily nodded. "He moves like one. Quiet. Always watching. And, he came out of the trees like one too. Like he was part of the woods." The name stuck. That night, as the storm returned with a fresh flurry, Emily refused to sleep in the loft. She made a bed of blankets near the fire, close to Shadow. Ruth, after some protest, gave in, muttering that it would only be one night. But it wasn't. It became a ritual. Shadow remained silent, but not indifferent. On the 3rd night, long after Emily had drifted off, Ruth sat by the hearth alone, sewing a patch into Emily's winter coat. The wind had started to rise again, and the trees creaked like old bones. From deep in the woods, a distant noise cracked through the quiet, perhaps a fox, perhaps something larger. Ruth paused, listening. Shadow's ears twitched. Then, slowly, he rose on 3 legs. The injured one barely touched the floor, but he limped to the door and sat, facing it directly. His body tensed, for bristling ever so slightly, though he never growled or barked. He simply watched. Ruth set the coat down and moved to stand behind him. Through the frost-rimmed window, she saw nothing. But Shadow remained motionless, a silent sentinel. It stirred something in her. Not fear, but familiarity. She had seen that posture before, in the jungle, long ago. The way the wounded dog refused to show weakness, how he kept guard despite pain, reminded her of the soldiers she once patched back together under flickering oil lamps. Men who had stared death in the eye and refused to blink. "He's a soldier," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. "Just like them." From that night on, she no longer argued when Emily kept him inside. She even started setting a second bowl near the fire, water warmed slightly, and later, scraps of broth-soaked bread. A week passed. Emily taught him to sit by gesture, to accept her brushing gently through the mats in his fur. She sang to him sometimes, quiet lullabies her mother once sang, tunes with no lyrics, just humming, as the snow fell thick against the cabin walls. On the 6th morning, Ruth ventured out to check the snare lines deeper in the woods. She insisted on going alone, as she always had. But Emily waited at the door, anxious. Hours passed. The sun sank. Then, as dusk gathered, a shape appeared through the snow. Ruth, limping slightly, coat torn, eyes wild. She had slipped on the ice near the ravine, twisted her knee badly, and had to use a branch as a crutch to hobble back. Emily rushed to her, but it was Shadow who surprised them both. The dog stood. His injured leg still trembled, but he walked, limped, toward Ruth. And when she stumbled, he nudged under her arm, allowing her to lean on his broad back, guiding her like a trained companion. Ruth didn't say anything at first, but later, as Emily tended to her leg by lantern light, she whispered, "I was wrong." Emily didn't reply. She only stroked Shadow's head gently as he lay beside the hearth once more, eyes closed but ears alert. The cabin, once so full of silence and snow, now held breath and warmth. 3 hearts. 1 fire. Shadow never barked, never whined. But he listened. And in his silence, he kept them both safe. The cold had settled into the bones of the land, wrapping the forest and the hills beyond in a silence so deep it seemed sacred. Snow blanketed everything, muffling even the sharpest creaks of the pine trees, turning the world into a quiet cathedral of white. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and popped gently in the hearth, casting warm flickers of amber light across the log walls and the two figures sitting close by. Emily knelt beside Shadow, a metal basin of warm water and a folded towel at her side. It had been 10 days since she dragged him out of the storm. 10 days of slow recovery, whispered lullabies, shared meals, and silent trust. Shadow was still limping, his back leg clearly bothering him, especially when the temperature dropped, but he was alert, following Emily with his eyes, sometimes even hobbling to greet her when she returned from gathering firewood. That afternoon, Emily decided to finally clean the wound properly. The swelling had gone down slightly, but the area around his haunch remained discolored, and small scabs clung stubbornly to the edges. She soaked a rag in the warm water and dabbed gently, peeling away the matted fur and dirt bit by bit. As she worked, something unusual caught her eye. Beneath the crusted blood and grime was a neat, curved scar, not from her own attempts to clean or from any recent injury. It was older, cleaner, and followed a shape too precise to be accidental. Her brows furrowed. The scar was straight and small, with thread marks barely visible, like something had been sewn by trained hands. "Gran," she called out, her voice tight with confusion. Ruth emerged from the kitchen corner, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been simmering a stew, venison and root vegetables from the cellar. The scent filled the cabin, mingling with smoke and pine sap. Her graying eyebrows lifted as she approached. Emily pointed. This was stitched. Ruth crouched slowly, her knees cracking in protest. Her nurse's eyes narrowed as she leaned in for a better look. "That's not your work," she muttered. "I never touched that part before." Ruth touched the scar lightly, then pulled away. "These aren't wild stitches." It was closed with sutures, probably surgical silk. "Someone fixed him up before." "Who would do that? A vet? Maybe. Or someone with field training." She paused, then added more quietly, "This dog's seen things." Ruth rose with difficulty and crossed to the corner where she kept an old cedar chest. From it, she pulled a weathered field manual, army green, the cover worn thin. She hadn't opened it in years. It had belonged to her husband, a combat medic who didn't return from his final tour. She opened to a diagram and compared it to what she had seen. "That's a military stitch," she confirmed. "Not the kind vets typically use." Emily stared at Shadow, now sleeping again, his head resting on his good front paw. "Do you think he was in the army?" "Could be. Military dogs are trained. They're not just pets. They track, attack, protect. They're soldiers. But why would they leave him?" Ruth didn't answer. As the wind began to pick up again outside, Emily rose and added another log to the fire. Shadow's tail thumped once, then went still. Later that afternoon, Emily bundled herself up and went out to the shed to look for more clean rags. As she opened the wooden chest they kept linens in, she noticed something tucked beneath an old tarp, an army surplus canvas bag neither she nor Ruth had touched in years. Inside, she found a tattered blanket, an empty canteen, and a metal collar tag, circular, about the size of a coin. The engraving was faint but still legible, K-92 Unit 438 USAF. She blinked. Air Force. Rushing inside, she showed Ruth the tag. Ruth took it in her palm, silent. Then she nodded slowly. "That confirms it. Shadow was military." Emily looked down at the dog. "But how did he end up out here? Alone? Could have been retired. Lost. Or worse." Ruth paused. "Some dogs, when they're no longer useful, they're put down. Others escape. Some are sold. There are programs for adoption, but not everyone treats them right. Emily felt something twist in her chest. We have to keep him. Ruth gave a tired smile. Honey, I think he's already keeping us. That evening, as the snow returned like an old ghost knocking on the roof, Emily sat on the floor, resting her head on Shadow's side. He was warm now. He didn't shake anymore in his sleep. And for the first time since he arrived, she heard him sigh, not in pain, but in peace. The snow had stopped falling overnight, and for the first time in over a week, sunlight spilled across the clearing outside the cabin. It was a pale, muted gold, barely warm enough to melt the frost clinging to the icicles that hung like teeth from the cabin's eaves. Emily was out near the woodpile, her breath visible in soft clouds as she stacked freshly chopped logs into the wire basket at her feet. Shadow lay nearby on a wool blanket, his injured leg stretched out, his eyes half-closed but alert. The sunlight hit his fur just right, making his black and tan coat gleam like brushed brass. Ruth was inside, kneading dough with her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Despite the stiffness in her fingers and the ache that lingered in her right knee since the fall, she found comfort in routine, something solid and grounded, like bread and firewood, in a world that often refused to be either. It was Emily who heard the voices first, distant, muffled by the snow, but unmistakably human. She froze, a piece of kindling in one mittened hand. Shadow's ears twitched. His head lifted. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared toward the tree line, muscles tightening like pulled wire. 3 men stepped out of the woods a few moments later. They were dressed in thick hunting gear, coats the color of dead leaves, heavy boots caked in snow, and hats pulled low over their brows. They moved like they belonged to the forest, but their presence felt foreign, invasive. The one in front was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with a wiry frame and a weather-beaten face half hidden behind a graying beard. His eyes were pale blue and unblinking, giving him the look of someone who never truly relaxed. This was Bill Sutter, a trapper known in the nearby towns for being curt, aggressive, and fiercely territorial. To his left walked a younger man, Dale, early 30s, stocky, with a red-tinged beard and eyes that darted around constantly, never resting in one place. Dale had a reputation as Bill's shadow, never leading, always backing the bigger man. The third man trailed a few steps behind. His name was Reed, a quiet, wiry figure with sunken cheeks and a scar that curled beneath one eye like a question mark. No one knew much about Reed, which somehow made him the most unsettling of the 3. Emily stepped protectively in front of Shadow, who had risen to his feet with effort, limping as he positioned himself at her side. He didn't make a sound. Bill raised a hand. "Afternoon," he called. Emily didn't answer. Ruth appeared on the porch then, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression hardening when she saw the men. "You're a long way from town," she said. "We were tracking something," Bill replied, stepping closer. "A big shepherd. Black and tan. Took down a deer near our camp 2 nights ago. Spooked our dogs bad. Bit one of 'em up pretty good. We followed prints till they vanished near here." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "You think it came through my land?" "Tracks ended not far from here." Reed spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but edged. "Could be it holed up somewhere close. Cabin like this, seems a good spot to hide." Emily's heart thumped wildly in her chest. She looked up at Ruth, begging silently for her to say something, do something. Ruth kept her tone even. "Haven't seen anything. And if we had, it wouldn't be your business. We've got a right to retrieve our property," Bill snapped. "That dog did damage. Ain't natural. Could be rabid." Emily stepped forward without meaning to. "He's not rabid." All eyes turned to her. Bill raised an eyebrow. Huh. Ruth stepped between them immediately. "Go back the way you came." Dale scowled. "You hiding something?" I'm protecting my land, Ruth said coldly. And my family. There was a tense pause. Then Bill gave a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We'll be back if we don't find him elsewhere. Tracks say what they say. They turned and walked back toward the woods. As they disappeared behind the trees, Emily exhaled shakily. Inside, Ruth bolted the door. Emily was pacing, her hands clenched at her sides. They know, she whispered. They're going to come back. Ruth sighed and sat heavily in the rocking chair. They suspect. That's not the same. But they'll keep looking. And if they find him, we won't let them. Shadow had retreated to the rug, resting his head between his front paws, but his eyes never left the door. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to every creak and groan the cabin made. She got up twice to check the windows. The snow had started falling again. Outside, the world looked calm. Peaceful even. But she knew better. She padded to the main room, where Shadow was curled up near the fire. She sat beside him, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. The dog shifted, pressing gently against her knee. She buried her fingers into his fur. I won't let them take you, she whispered. You found us. That means something. Behind her, Ruth stood silently in the doorway, arms crossed. She said nothing. Just watched the girl and the dog, her gaze unreadable. Snow had fallen again overnight, fine and crystalline, covering the land in a fresh coat of silence. The sky outside the cabin was an unbroken slate, threatening more flurries before nightfall. Inside, warmth radiated from the hearth as Shadow lay curled in his usual spot, his breathing deep and even. Emily sat nearby at the table, a small cloth in her hand, carefully cleaning the old leather collar that had been looped loosely around Shadow's neck since the day she found him. It was a battered thing, cracked in places, with the metal ring tarnished and the buckle stiff. Still, something about it felt important, like it held a story she hadn't yet heard. As she ran the damp cloth along the inside edge, her fingers brushed against a ridge in the leather, something stitched beneath the surface. She paused. With a frown of curiosity, Emily brought the collar closer to the firelight. A small section on the inner seam looked newer, darker, as if repaired by someone with rushed, trembling hands. It wasn't decorative, and it didn't match the rest of the collar's wear. Her heart thumped. She remembered the way Ruth had once stitched her school bag back together, fast, functional, but obvious if you looked close. She grabbed Ruth's sewing kit from the shelf and, with a pair of small scissors, began to snip the uneven thread. The stitching gave way with little resistance. She peeled back the leather flap and gasped. Inside was a thin, flat piece of metal, roughly the size of a silver dollar, cool to the touch even near the fire. She held it up to the light. Engraved on the surface in worn but legible text were the words. K-92 USAF Unit 438 Do Not Remove. Her breath caught. Gran, she called, voice unsteady. Ruth appeared from the back room, her hands still dusty from packing root vegetables in burlap. She noticed Emily's expression immediately. What is it? Emily held out the tag in both hands. Ruth took it gently, reading the inscription. Her brow furrowed. K-92, she murmured. U.S. Air Force. This is a K-9 designation. He wasn't just trained, he was registered. You said before he might have been military, Emily said, voice rising with emotion. But this proves it, doesn't it? Ruth nodded slowly. More than that. This isn't a vet's tag or civilian issue. This is military inventory. Do not remove, this was meant to stay hidden. Emily sat down hard on the bench. Why would someone hide it inside his collar? To protect him, Ruth said, rubbing her thumb over the etched letters. Or maybe to keep him from being tracked. If he ran, if someone was looking for him. Shadow, sensing their energy, rose shakily and limped over. He nosed Emily's elbow and then sat beside her, tail still. Ruth looked at the dog with new eyes. He was never meant to be in civilian hands. Someone broke protocol. Emily whispered, or they abandoned him. Ruth didn't answer. Later that day, they laid the collar and the tag out on the kitchen table, next to an old map and Ruth's army-issued flashlight. Emily ran her fingers over the numbers, trying to imagine the life Shadow had before he staggered into their clearing. "Do you think they'll come looking for him?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," Ruth replied, her tone flat. "But more likely, whoever let him go didn't want to be found. These tags, they don't end up sewn into collars by mistake. Someone was hiding him. Or protecting him from the wrong people." Emily felt a familiar knot twist in her chest. Like a soldier running from something. Or from someone. The idea weighed heavy. That night, as they sat by the fire, Emily held the collar in her lap. She looked down at Shadow, who lay resting with his head on her foot, eyes closed, breathing slow. His ears twitched once, then went still. "I don't care what they used you for," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're home now. You don't have to be anyone's weapon anymore." She leaned down and kissed the top of his head. Shadow stirred just slightly and let out a long breath, the kind that carried more than air. It carried memory, pain, maybe even relief. In the quiet that followed, Ruth sat at the table, polishing the old rifle Daniel had left behind. Her movements were steady, practiced. She wasn't expecting trouble, but she was preparing for it. Just in case. Because sometimes the past didn't stay buried, no matter how much snow you packed on top of it. The storm returned without warning. It began as a hush in the trees, an unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows like a held breath. Then the wind howled to life, rising from the hills like a beast disturbed. Thick snowflakes followed, not gentle this time, but fast, aggressive, sideways, hammering against the cabin walls with unrelenting force. The light outside vanished into white, and the forest disappeared behind a moving wall of snow. Inside, Emily was crouched beside Shadow near the hearth. His breathing had become labored sometime after dusk, and his body burned with fever. His nose was dry and hot, and his paws trembled when he tried to shift positions. Emily soaked a rag in cool water and gently pressed it to his brow. The moment her hand left, Shadow whimpered low in his throat, his first real sound in days. Not pain. Fear. Ruth stood by the table, her eyes on the window. She had sensed it too, something beyond the storm. Her instincts, dulled by years of peace, had stirred like a long-sleeping hound waking to danger. She moved with purpose, locking the door, sliding the bar across the heavy timber, then checking the rifle's chamber. Daniel's rifle. The same one she hadn't touched in years until last week. Her hands were steady, but her jaw tightened with every gust of wind that rattled the glass. Shadow stirred again. This time his ears twitched and he growled, low and unsteady. He didn't rise, didn't bark, his body too weak, but something inside him recognized a scent or a sound the others couldn't hear. Emily froze, her hand still resting against his fevered chest. A sudden knock, sharp, deliberate, cut through the storm. Ruth motioned Emily back with a firm hand and stepped silently toward the window. She used the edge of her sleeve to wipe a circle in the fogged glass. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out the shapes, 3 figures, their outlines thick under heavy coats, one holding something long and dark. Ruth didn't open the door. She raised her voice, loud and clear. "What do you want?" Bill Sutter's voice came in response, distorted by the wind. "We're back for that dog. Ain't safe to leave him in your hands. He's dangerous. Ask anyone." Ruth didn't answer. She moved to the fire and handed Emily the rifle. "I can't," Emily began, her voice a shaky whisper. "You won't need to fire it," Ruth said calmly. "Just hold it. If they break the door, you aim for the floor in front of them. It's the sound that matters." Not the shot. She didn't wait for a reply. She pulled on her coat and stepped back toward the door, her own rifle in hand. Shadow, sensing her movement, lifted his head weakly and let out a whimper, but Ruth didn't hesitate. Outside, the storm swallowed everything. Dale stood beside Bill, holding a shotgun. Reed, farther back, was watching the tree line, his face unreadable beneath a wool scarf. Snow coated their shoulders, but their posture was tense, purposeful. "You're not taking him," Ruth said, voice hard. "He's sick." "You saw what he was." "I saw what he did," Bill snapped. "You think it's coincidence he ends up here? After what happened to our dog? He's trained. And dangerous. We've seen dogs like him before. Killers. He's not a threat. Not unless you force him to be." Bill took a step forward. "I won't ask again." Behind Ruth, Emily stood just inside the cabin, heart pounding. She clutched the rifle, fingers trembling. She thought about the tag in the collar, about the scar on Shadow's leg, about the way he had helped Ruth walk when no one asked him to. She thought about the nights he slept with his head on her feet. Shadow was more than a dog. He was a survivor. Just like them. Bill raised his hand in signal, but the door didn't break. Instead, a voice cut through the storm. One not belonging to any of them. From the woods behind the cabin came a deep bark. Then another. And then a howl, not canine, but human. Short, high-pitched. A warning. All three men turned, weapons raised. In the distance, two figures emerged from the trees. A man and a woman. Strangers. The man was in his 50s, tall and lean, dressed in a heavy green coat and military-issue boots. His face was tanned and creased, with grizzled stubble and dark eyes that scanned the clearing like a hawk. A veteran's stance, deliberate, grounded. This was Frank Maddox, a former handler who'd worked with K-9 units during Desert Storm. Now a volunteer tracker and wildlife consultant in the area. Beside him walked a younger woman, early 30s, small, wiry, wearing a thick parka and ski goggles pushed up to her forehead. This was Janelle Croft, a field researcher and dog behaviorist known in nearby counties for rehabbing mistreated working dogs. She carried no weapon, only a leather bag slung across her shoulder. Frank raised a gloved hand. "Bill, stand down." Bill stiffened. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Tracking the dog," Frank replied. "We picked up his trail 3 days ago after a call from someone who recognized the unit code. You're not the only one who noticed him." Reed shifted uneasily. Janelle stepped forward. "We're not here to take him by force. We just want to know who has him, and if he's being cared for." Ruth didn't lower her rifle. "He's safe here. You won't take him." "We don't want to," Frank said evenly. "Unless he's a danger." Which, doesn't seem to be the case. "He's sick," Emily called from the doorway. "Fever. Can't walk." Janelle's face softened. "Then let me help." Bill looked ready to argue, but Dale tugged his coat, whispering something. Bill spat into the snow, furious but outnumbered. "Fine," he growled. "You deal with him. But when he snaps, don't say I didn't warn you." The hunters backed away, disappearing into the snow as quickly as they'd come. Inside, Janelle knelt beside Shadow, who barely lifted his head. She pulled off her gloves, checked his vitals with experienced hands, and looked up. "He's burning up," she said. "We need to lower his temperature fast. And he needs fluids." They worked through the night, Ruth boiling water, Janelle feeding it through a dropper, Emily wiping Shadow's ears with snow. Frank remained near the window, watching the woods with a stillness that made even the wind feel cautious. By dawn, the storm had passed. The light returned, slow and golden. Shadow was still weak, but his fever had broken. His breathing was steady. His ears twitched at the sound of Emily's voice. He was alive. The night was ink-dark, lit only by the glow of embers in the hearth and the faint shimmer of moonlight through the frost-glazed windows. The storm had passed, leaving a stillness behind that felt too quiet, too brittle, like the hush before a scream. Inside the cabin, warmth fought to hold its ground against the cold that seeped through every crack in the old wood. Emily sat by Shadow's side, her hand resting gently on his ribs as they rose and fell in shallow, even rhythm. He was better. Not well, but better. Fever gone. Eyes brighter. His body still thin and bruised, but alive. Ruth was at the table, oiling the rifle again, though she hadn't needed to fire it. Not yet. The tension from the previous night still clung to her shoulders, and her movements were tight, controlled. Frank Maddox had stayed through the evening, seated near the door like a silent guardian. His presence had brought a strange comfort to Ruth. He was steady, not overbearing, and spoke with a quiet conviction she trusted. Janelle had returned to the animal shelter at the base of the mountain that afternoon, promising to come back the next day with antibiotics and clean gauze. But Ruth felt uneasy now that she was gone. Emily dozed off briefly, head on Shadow's back, when the first sound came, something hard and flat striking the wooden door. A bang, sudden and sharp. Not a knock. A demand. Ruth shot up from her chair. "Emily," she said sharply. "Up. Get behind the stove." Emily stirred groggily. "What is it?" "Trouble." The door shook again. Frank moved like a shadow, reaching for the old revolver strapped to his side. He had removed his coat but kept his boots on, an old habit from his deployment years. His expression darkened, and he glanced at Ruth. "That's not just someone passing by." The third strike on the door was louder, splintering one of the outer planks. A voice shouted through the gap. "Open up. You've got something that ain't yours." Bill Sutter. Emily gasped. "He's back." Shadow stirred at the sound, ears lifting. He let out a sharp bark, his first in days, then dragged himself to his feet with a shaky resolve. His injured leg buckled, but he caught himself against the cabin wall, placing himself directly between Emily and the door. Frank looked out the window, eyes narrowing. 3 of them again. Armed. They're spread out this time. Reed's voice called next, calmer, but no less chilling. "We know he's in there. You can't hide a dog like that. We saw the tracks. And we saw that tag." Emily looked up, panicked. The tag, it was on the table. Ruth's gaze snapped to the small leather collar lying by the lamp, the military ID tag still gleaming faintly under the oil light. The door shook again. Frank raised his voice. "Leave now, or this ends badly." A pause. Then Dale's muffled voice, "He saved my boy." Silence fell. Ruth's brows knitted. She moved to the window, pulled back the curtain slightly. Bill and Reed were standing near the porch, guns raised but not aimed. Dale stood farther back, coat unzipped, hands shaking slightly. "What did you say?" Ruth shouted through the door. Dale stepped forward. He was younger than the other two, stocky with round shoulders, a worn knit cap pulled low over his forehead. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from the cold or something else, Ruth couldn't tell. 3 years ago, he said, voice cracking. "In Idaho. Our unit was pinned. There was a minefield. We couldn't move. One of the dogs, he went in anyway. Found the charges. Got hit before the last one. I didn't know he lived. Until I saw that tag. K-92. That was him." Shadow growled once but didn't move, his eyes locked on the door as if he too recognized the voice. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe." Bill looked confused, even shaken. "You said nothing about that." I didn't know until I saw the tag. Reed lowered his rifle first, letting it drop to his side. I don't want to fight a war we already lost. Frank opened the door a crack. The wind cut in, cold and immediate. You're not getting him, he said simply. Dale nodded. We don't want him back. Not if he's got a home. Ruth stepped into the doorway beside Frank, the rifle now lowered. Her voice softened, but not by much. You nearly started a war over a ghost. Bill looked from Ruth to Emily, then to Shadow, who now stood proudly, still and noble despite his weakness. Something in Bill's shoulders slackened, not quite regret, but weariness. He grunted and turned without a word, disappearing into the trees. Reed followed, casting one last glance back at the cabin before fading into the night. Dale lingered. Can I say goodbye? Ruth looked at Emily. Emily looked at Shadow. Shadow limped forward, steady and deliberate. Dale crouched, reaching out slowly, his gloved hand trembling as it touched Shadow's head. The dog didn't pull back. Instead, he licked the man's hand once, then returned to Emily's side. Thank you, Dale said, voice rough. For not giving up on him. Ruth nodded once. We never will. When the door closed again, and the locks were drawn tight, the cabin seemed to exhale. The storm outside was quiet now. The battle hadn't been fought with bullets, but with truths long buried, and wounds older than scars. Later, as Emily drifted off to sleep beside Shadow, she whispered, they saw who you are. Not just what you were. Shadow rested his head on her lap, his eyes finally at peace. Morning arrived not with a bang, but a hush, soft and bright, like the exhale of a land that had held its breath too long. The storm had finally passed. Outside the cabin, the world was no longer a flurry of white chaos but a glittering expanse of gentle frost. Trees stood tall and still beneath coats of snow, the branches heavy but unmoving. Sunlight glinted off icicles, making them sparkle like tiny daggers of glass suspended in a dream. Inside the cabin, the tension had lifted like mist burned off by dawn. The fire crackled lazily, content rather than defensive. The rifle sat untouched on the table. The door was locked, but not barricaded. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her fingers carefully pulling yarn through an old wooden needle. Her brows furrowed in concentration as she worked stitch by stitch on a small, handmade collar, something humble, something hers. Across from her sat Ruth, equally focused, her hands more skilled but slower now with age. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Shadow lay stretched out in front of the fire. He looked thinner than the day he arrived, his ribs still slightly visible, one ear still nicked from frostbite, but his eyes were bright, alert. His breathing was steady, his wounds clean and closed. He watched Emily with unblinking attention, occasionally shifting his weight to rest his head on his paws. The fever had left him 2 days ago. Since then, he had slowly begun to eat again, first in small nibbles, then, last night, a full bowl of venison broth and mashed potatoes, his favorite, it seemed. The events of the previous night still echoed in Emily's memory. Dale's voice breaking in the cold, the way Shadow had limped forward and touched his head to the man's hand. It had been the end of something, not just the confrontation, but of the doubt that had shadowed them all. Shadow's past no longer loomed like a question mark. He had been a soldier, yes. A hero, even. But now, he was something else entirely. Family. There was a knock at the door, not the kind that froze your spine, but a light, polite tap. Emily looked up. Ruth set down her yarn and moved to answer it, glancing through the window first. When she opened the door, Janelle Croft stood there, bundled in a thick gray parka, her cheeks pink from the cold. She smiled when she saw Shadow sitting up. Well, look who's looking better. Emily beamed. He ate everything last night. Janelle stepped inside, brushing snow from her sleeves. That's a good sign. He's healing. You did everything right. I didn't do it alone, Emily said. She looked over at Ruth. Ruth simply grunted, but there was the ghost of a smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. Janelle knelt beside Shadow, checked his eyes, his ears, the scar on his leg. Good. The infection's gone. That leg's healing well too. He'll always have a limp, but it won't slow him down much. Emily touched the nearly finished collar in her lap. I'm making him something new. It's beautiful, Janelle said sincerely. He'll wear it with pride. They had made the collar from soft wool yarn in 2 colors, dark forest green and chestnut brown. Emily had chosen them to match the trees and the earth beneath the snow. Ruth had added a small wooden button with an old carved star on it, taken from Daniel's military coat, worn and faded, but whole. After Janelle left with a hug and a promise to visit again, the cabin grew quiet once more. Emily stood and walked over to Shadow, kneeling beside him. He lifted his head and leaned gently into her. She slipped the collar over his head and adjusted the wooden button under his chin. There, she whispered. Now you're officially ours. Shadow tilted his head, as if considering the meaning of the moment. Then, slowly, his tail wagged, just once. Emily gasped. He wagged his tail, she said to Ruth. I saw it, Ruth replied from her chair, though her voice was softer than usual. First time. Emily giggled, burying her face in Shadow's neck. You're really here now. And then Shadow did something he had never done before. With careful grace, he leaned forward and licked her hand, once, gently, like a promise. It was not the licking of a hungry animal or a trained response. It was deliberate, warm, and filled with something unspoken. Ruth set down her yarn and stood, her knees cracking slightly. She crossed the room and knelt beside Emily and Shadow. For a long moment, the 3 of them stayed there, 3 survivors, each with different scars, stitched together by cold nights, firelight, and the kind of love that didn't ask for anything in return. Ruth reached out and rested her hand on Shadow's head. You're home now, she said. Whatever came before, that's over. Outside, snow melted in tiny rivulets along the cabin's edge. Birds returned to the branches. And from far across the hills, the sound of a distant creek running beneath the thaw could be heard if you listened close enough. Winter still lingered. But spring had begun. Sometimes, miracles don't come in flashes of lightning or parting skies, they come in the form of a wounded dog, a child with a brave heart, and an old woman learning to hope again. Shadow wasn't just a rescue. He was a reminder that even the most forgotten souls can find their way home when love leads the way. Just like God places people in our lives for a reason, He placed Shadow in Emily's path, not to be saved, but to save. In our busy lives, we often overlook the quiet blessings, the wag of a tail, the warmth of a hand, the silence of trust. But it's in these simple moments that we feel God's presence the most. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never truly lost. Leave a comment, type Amen if you believe in second chances, and don't forget to like and subscribe. May God bless you and your loved ones with warmth, healing, and the kind of love that never lets go.